My name is Ed Arnold. I'm a security solution architect at Qualys in our application security department. Today I'm going to talk about API security and how you can use the current Qualys Web Application Scanning product to scan your Postman collections and assess those APIs for security vulnerabilities. So briefly, we're at a Postman conference. APIs are everywhere nowadays. There's really been an explosion since we turned from the SOAP web services and XML over to RESTful services, and now GraphQL and other things, coming down the pipeline. There were a couple of reasons for that. Lots of mobile devices, IoT devices, modern web applications. Those are all using APIs on their backends. Internally, you may have systems with APIs. You may be doing some sort of a microservice architecture, reusing components for better scalability and resiliency. So those are frequently going to be using APIs. You may also be using vendor APIs on a regular basis to access information or perform various actions. For instance, Qualys has APIs for all of our products to allow integrations with ticketing systems, CI/CD systems, and the like. And those APIs really could be hosted anywhere. Those could be in the public cloud. Those could be in your internal environment. Again, they could be at a vendor's environment. So you're interacting with APIs, lots of them, and all coming from different places. So of course, with that rise in APIs comes a rise in API breaches. Recently, you may have seen it in other talks, the OWASP API Security Top 10 was released as a companion to their normal application security top 10. And that's listed here. We're going to dive into a few of these individually, but I just want to point out a couple while we're on this page. API 4, lack of resources and rate limiting. 9, improper asset management. 10, insufficient logging and monitoring. A lot of those aren't going to be, you could test for some of it, but frequently you're not going to test resources and rate limiting due to it being potentially leading to a denial of service condition. You just want to make sure in policy that you have things scaled appropriately for their use and any rate limiting applied that will be necessary. For improper asset management, it's really about proper versioning of your APIs and not having debug endpoints available. And while you could test for some of those, you really should make sure you have a strong policy around that. And additionally, insufficient logging and monitoring is another item that's not typically going to be able to be tested, especially tested from the outside. So that's, again, another thing you're just going to have strong policy and procedure around. I do want to call out these three, API 1, 2, and 5. And you'll notice they're all the ones that have broken in the title. But broken object level authorization, broken user authentication, and broken function level authentication are really the ones I see as the most common cause of breaches. I've been pen testing APIs for about 10 years, and they're definitely the most common that I see. And when you do find them, they're definitely the ones that cause the most impact. So let's just dive into those a little bit and make sure explain those. So API 1 is broken object level authorization. Some people are calling it BOLA, but this is analogous to IDOR, or insecure direct object reference in web applications. Essentially, it just means that your people are able to access an object in a way that's insecure. So in this example, perhaps you're user 1, and you can access the endpoint for the details for user 1. But simply incrementing the number to 2 may allow you to have access to user 2's details, which shouldn't be allowed and would be an access control vulnerability. And of course, it doesn't need to be as simple as an integer to still apply to broken object level authorization. It could be the username in that parameter in that field. I've even seen an MD5 of the email address of the user getting used. And at first glance, it may look like it's a GUID or some sort of random string. But then you MD5 a few email addresses and realize that that's actually how they're doing their access. So API 5 is broken function level authorization. So this can take on a few different flavors. One of them is verb tampering. So you may have an exposed endpoint to the users for a put to their user to update their user information. but they may not have access to the delete command. It's not documented. It's not listed anywhere in their documentation. But of course, an attacker is going to try those verbs, and they may find that issuing the delete verb to that same endpoint results in the user being deleted. So this would just be a case where really it's trying, I guess, for security through obscurity. Just because it's not documented doesn't mean it's not there. So you really need to ensure you don't have those endpoints that you think no one's going to discover out there. Also applies to unlisted functionality. They, through your documentation and through your Postman collection or your Open API documentation, they may be able to, see and take an inventory of what operations are available, and then potentially infer based on the structure of the paths some additional functions that are available that are not exposed. So again, it's important to not try to hide functionality behind anything. If there is that functionality, make sure it requires, admin authentication at the token level, because as we will see, there is also frequently broken user authentication in APIs. And we just saw a great example of this with SolarWinds, not the supply chain attack side, but CVE 2020-10148 was an authentication bypass by use of a file extension. If you apply a specific file extension to the request, it would bypass authentication. So that definitely is one type of broken user authentication bypasses. There's also just lack of authentication. You may state that authentication is required, but when it actually gets to the endpoint, the authentication is not required. You may also have cases where requests get processed before the authentication is actually verified. So they'll send in a request with some malicious content and also their token that's invalid. But the server will actually process that and spit out that you have invalid data before it says you're not authenticated. So you want to avoid that situation and make sure people can't either deny a service by not needing authentication to send numerous requests to your endpoint, or being able to perform actions without authentication. And this can also rear its head through API 3, which is excessive data exposure. In this example, it's shown here in a screenshot from Postman. If you make a request on this API to an administrative endpoint, it tells you the isAdmin header is missing. So as an attacker, you just know you need to apply the isAdmin header and then try true, try any representation of a positive. And in this case, it happened to be true, was the value it was looking for, but that allowed you to bypass authentication just by putting a header that said isAdmin equals true. Briefly, I'd like to discuss mass assignment, which is API 6. This I may have made a brief appearance on the OWASP application security top 10. I remember it being kind of talked about a lot when Ruby on Rails development was going on. It seemed to be susceptible to this issue, but it's back on the API list. So I just want to talk about it to make sure it's a fully understood vulnerability. So in this example, the user may have an endpoint that's a GET that allows them to return the data about themselves. And they get back their first name, their last name, their address, their city, and a field called isAdmin, which equals 0 for their user account. But then they go ahead and they look at the documentation, the Postman collection, and they see that for the update to their account, the only parameters that are sent are the first name, the last name, the address, and the city. The isAdmin is not there. That's not an updatable field. However, what happens if they just try to add it? The typical put request would not have the isAdmin, but they go ahead and update and change the isAdmin to 1 and submit that request. If you have a mass assignment vulnerability, they're going to be able to change that field in your database, even though it wasn't intended to be exposed through that operation. So again, users can get this information by potentially just getting their information and seeing additional fields, or by looking through your documentation and kind of inferring or making educated guesses on what the backend data store looks like. So it's definitely something you want to look out for. I haven't seen it as much in APIs personally recently, but I did used to see it. And so watch out for that kind of thing. And a final note on the top 10, API 8 injection. It gets a lot of debate when it comes to cross-site scripting. I don't think you're going to get a lot of debate on SQL injection or potentially some other types of injection. But with cross-site scripting in particular, I see some pushback from practitioners where they're not interested in cross-site scripting attacks in APIs due to a JSON response. Potentially even it's true machine-to-machine API, doesn't even have a UI to have a script execute in. But that might not be the only place that ends up. With the increase in use of microservice architectures, that same API may be reused for multiple different products or services. So you may not be everywhere that shows up. It could be as simple as that attack generates an error, which goes to an error log, and then an administrator looks at some sort of interface that lets them view their errors. And that is a UI, that is a web-based console, and it'll execute. So just a word of warning before writing off a potential low-level input validation issue or a cross-site scripting that's being reported in a test, that just because this particular instance it may not execute, that doesn't mean it won't end up somewhere else. So make sure that input validation or output encoding is still happening, even if you don't think it's going to lead to an attack. All right, so briefly, let's talk about the Qualys Web Application Scanning product. The Qualys WAS product is one of Qualys's approximately 20 applications at this time. If you're not familiar with us, our main focus is, well, it's all on security. The product people are most familiar with is VM, vulnerability management, although it's now vulnerability management detection and response. We've added some patch management capabilities. We also have container security, file integrity monitoring, indicators of compromise, EDR, all sorts of products out there. But specifically, our web application scanning product is what allows us to do security testing of APIs right now. But just some highlights of that. We're very low cost of ownership. You pay per application or API. Does not matter how many users or how many scans you run on that. We are a cloud-based company, and we're very scalable. We have customers scanning thousands of applications at a time. Obviously, we're not a point solution. You can integrate us with the whole Qualys platform and all of those applications I was mentioning. When it comes to scanning, you can have scheduled scans. You can have ad hoc scans. You can group your applications together via however you like, but typically by development group or region or something like that. And you can launch those all at the same time. We obviously perform API scanning. We have built for the enterprise with role-based access control, that tagging I was mentioning, customizable reports. We allow you to work your vulns right in our platform as far as retesting or ignoring things. And again, we do have full APIs, and we have a comprehensive API for web application scanning. We integrate with our own web application firewall. We integrate with CI/CD tools, currently Jenkins, TeamCity, Bamboo, and Azure DevOps. And we also have integrations with Burp Suite and BugCrowd. We also, obviously, we have Postman support that we introduced about a year ago. Just last month, we added GraphQL support inside of Postman, but we can now parse and correctly understand and test GraphQL as well. So we do have that Postman support. As you can see, you provide your collection, your environmental variables, or any global variables. And these can be full-featured collections that have pre-request scripts and tests as well that execute various actions. Those will be supported and execute during your test as well. Briefly, before we get into the demo, I just want to mention a new module that we have coming very soon, should be very soon. And it's called API Security. This, however, will not be Postman related. This will be focused around Swagger and the Open API specification. So potentially the file you use to create your Postman collections. But so what this will do is you'll be able to either import to the platform a Swagger or Open API file, or we will initially have some plugins for some IDEs to enable you to just right-click and scan your Open API specification without going out to the Qualys platform. But what it will do is a static assessment of the file itself and give you a score based on its hardening and provide recommendations on further hardening your Open API specification. So it may be adding a pattern to an input for validation with a regular expression, maybe it's a number value and you need a number of characters or a min-max value for that. So it'll allow you to edit it right in our platform, make those changes, rescore it, and see how you're doing. And once you're satisfied with that file, the other part it's going to do is a conformance scan. So it's going to take the file that you've provided, which is essentially the contract for your API. It tells people how your API works. Our test scanner will test that it actually follows that contract. So if it says it needs to be a number between 1 and 10, we'll try 100 and see what happens. If it says it has to be 2 characters, we'll try 3. And ensure the API on the server side reacts to what it's advertising that it does. And then we'll also bring a vulnerability scan into this as well, but that currently exists in the Web Application Scanning product. And then in the future, with this product, there will also be a API firewall for that runtime protection. And this is being developed in partnership with 42 Crunch, who you may have seen a presentation from here at this conference. So with that, we're going to get into the demo. Pardon me while I stop sharing and switch. All right, hope everyone can see. Here we have a Postman collection for a purposely vulnerable API called Tiredful that you can find out there on GitHub. But it's just a collection with a few requests. We have authentication, and this is going to be an OAuth authentication, and we're going to have a test that on the response. Let me pick my environment, remember how to use Postman. We get our access token back, and this is going to get saved as the environmental variable token, so that in subsequent requests that require the token, as we can see here, we need the token for the header. We send that. It's already been stored as a variable, so it'll happen automatically. I also want to point out, so these are just normal requests with gets. This approve one, and they all have tests, but this one has a kind of a negative test. So this authentication that we're doing in this collection is for a low-level user. So they do not have access to the approve article endpoint. So for this, in our test, instead of asserting that it comes back a 200, we actually want to assert that it comes back a 403. We want this to say forbidden. They should not have access to it. So this is a way you can put some simple access control tests right into your Postman collections by just validating, giving it some endpoints that maybe it shouldn't have access to, and just validating that in fact happens. Once you have your whole collection, I do suggest running it. Frequently, you're gonna, if you're a security person, you're gonna get these from a development group, and they might be at varying levels of maturity and quality. So I would suggest running it and just making sure that all of it passes. If you want to dig into it and see all the tests that passed as well. But it looks like this collection is good, so we want to move it over to Qualys. So for that, we're going to need to export the collection. So from the collection overview, we can click this and we can export. And either of these formats will work, but obviously we suggest as well as Postman, the 2.1 version. And you can export that. Since I am using a collection with the URL and some additional variables in it, an environment with that, we're going to have to export that as well. So if we go to edit, again, we have some dots and we can export. And great, I have those 2 files downloaded to my system, and now I can put them into Qualys. So please bear with me while I switch to that. All right. So we're over at Qualys, and for anything you want to scan, as you stated, you need to have an application created. So I have one started here, so let's take a look at this. I've named it the Tiredful API, and I have its URL, and it's to the API folder. A note here, if you're reading along with me, you'll see that this is asking for the web application URL or the Swagger file URL. So if you're not using a Postman collection and you just have Swagger or OpenAPI collection, documentation, you can also point our scanner directly at that. We will go out, parse that file, create rules based to fuzz the parameters, and test the file. So you can point us directly at OpenAPI or Swagger documentation for the scan as well. But so we have this here. If you go to application details, I'm actually going to choose an option to restrict this to the API folder. There's additional content out here. There's a web UI, and I don't want that scanned as part of this scan, so I'm just going to restrict it to the API folder. Also in our collection, if you noticed, the authentication endpoint was to an OAuth folder. So what this is going to do is not test that authentication endpoint. You may want to, or you may not want to. I do not want to at this point. So by restricting it to this folder, it's going to be able to use the authentication and send the calls, but it's not going to test it. So I'm not going to hammer on that OAuth authentication endpoint. So once you have your scope set properly, you can add your Postman collection. So just like the screenshot, we'll check that, and we'll choose our file and upload it. And you could also drag and drop. We'll add our collection, and we'll add our environmental variables. Great, and we have those there. Additionally, if for some reason you only have a proxy capture of your API traffic, we do support that as well. This is another point to make briefly. This is an internal appliance. If you're familiar with Qualys, or I may have mentioned that we're a cloud provider, but we also you're able to scan your internal items as well with us. You just need a virtual scanner appliance, just a small VM that runs in your environment. So in this case, I am scanning something internal to my network. So I'm just choosing an internal scanner appliance from this dropdown. One additional item you may want to do when you're doing an API scan is to provide path fuzzing rules. When you have parameters values in paths, frequently to scanners, to web tools, these just look like folders. That's the way the web was structured. You have folders and then you had parameters. But with rewritten URLs and friendly URLs and RESTful APIs, frequently you're going to have essentially a parameter and then the parameter's value looking like two separate folders. So what this does is enable you to tell the scanner that, hey, these values here are the parameter values. So when we have exams and then some long number, the parameter is exams and the value is that number. That's not a folder. So that's where we want to fuzz things. We want to inject things there. That's where an attack could take place. Don't try to look for other folder paths. Try to look for attacks. So you can specify those as well. If you use burp, this is very similar to burp's intruder, where you mark the injection point. Also, if you have incrementing values here, if for instance, maybe you had articles and it went articles 1 through 1,000, it would tell our scanner that that's a variable and that is going to keep increasing and to not keep guessing new ones because it's going to go on for a long time. So authentication, I have it built into my collection, obviously. You could also have it as header injection. So if you just have a token that you want to use and not get it live, you can just type in your token here as a header, and that will get passed with every request. I would, try to avoid that. That's going to be fine for a one-off scan, but if you want to schedule this scan to be repeatable, to be a monthly scan, you're going to want to do that. Looks like my time is getting short, so we're not going to launch a scan. We're just going to jump over to see a scan that was already run. So we'll take a look at this API demo scan that was run last night against this collection. So quickly to point out, we do return the Postman collection status just like the runner. So it's going to show you the status code and then any tests that you had along with it, if those passed as well, and show you, you can accurately verify that the parameter substitution from the environmental variables worked appropriately. So for this, we're going to have that cross-site scripting, those unencoded characters. We even rate this low in potential, but this is one of those places where if you see an injection coming back, you need to know everywhere that that's going to get used because that could be a problem. This also has SQL injection, has a path disclosure, kind of the API 3. There is a bugs endpoint back here that's logging errors that's not exposed and wasn't listed that our scanner brute forced for. In addition, another API 3, a verbose error message, and it's over clear text, so we got insecure transport. But essentially, this allows you to just upload those files. You could have them already created, so it's very little work typically for a security department. Create an application and import it, and run a scan. And this is going to find you a lot of those vulnerabilities from the API top 10. Some of the access control are going to require some deeper looks and some manual testing and some good knowledge of the API, more than a typical black box scanner will have. But this definitely is a good way to get you started and can fit into your CI/CD environment and be performed in an automated fashion.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ed. I actually have to run to another session, but there are some questions in the Slido tab over to the right, 2 from Carrie, and I think there is another one in the chat. Ed, let me know if you have any issues finding those questions. This session does not have to close right now, so if anyone here has any other questions they would like to ask Ed, please feel free to add it in the Slido, and enjoy the rest of the Galaxy Tour and sessions. Thanks so much, Ed. Appreciate it.
All right, bear with me here. I'm going to read these things. Thank you for whoever shared a permission thing. I'll take a look at that later. Yes, if Rick, you're still there, the 42 crunch was the API security that unfortunately I could only show a screenshot of. I just don't have access to the test environment, but it's done, it's working. So yes, that is what's in partnership with 42 Crunch, and that will be coming very shortly. Should be this quarter. Great. Go over to Slido. Q&A. Yes, we do provide free trials, proof of concept accounts for any of our products. So if you're interested in web application scanning, that's completely possible. Just you can go to qualys.com and request a trial. They'll figure out where you are and get an account manager in contact with you to get your trial running. But it's full featured. Anything you need to do, you can do. And if you do become a customer, anything you do during the trial is just in your account permanently. So you don't need to redo any work, rebuild any workflows or anything like that. Right now, I don't believe we're looking for any beta testers. We have enough customers, I think, that will be interested in it right now. And us personally, we'll be testing it quite a bit. So great. If anyone needs to reach out to me or would like to reach out to me, we didn't actually get to my last slide that had my email address on it. So my email address is earnold@qualys.com. Pretty straightforward. But yeah, so thanks everyone for hanging in there with me through my issues, and hope you enjoyed it. But thank you.